So Eleanor, will go ahead and record it now. And so just a little bit of background on Rising Solutions and myself. So we have two different arms of the company. Rising Solutions is our client and consulting arm, where we predominantly work with social sector clients. That might be, for your reference, the Rainforest Alliance, the International Rescue Committee, the UN. We work with governments, and we also work with corporates, but only on social innovation specifically. We typically don't do corporate innovation. We feel strongly about the social focus of our innovation efforts. And then the other arm of the company is called Rising Innovators. And Rising Innovators is our learning, training, and product development arm of the company. And that is kind of the umbrella under which we are presenting our session for you today. So Ryan Hill is a close friend of ours, whom we met actually at a fellow creativity conference. And as we started exchanging stories about our facilitation experiences, and specifically about what it takes to foster creativity within the workplace, Ryan unveiled to us that he has expertise using board games for creativity. And given the mindsets that we are often facing in the environments where we're trying to bring in more creativity, which are often very analytical, very structured mindsets. When we heard that he was successfully using board games, we were most intrigued, and we thought it would make a great learning topic for you today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ryan. Ryan, if you want to go ahead and give a wave. And Ryan is currently based in Colorado Springs. And by the way, we are calling this, or we're thinking of it as, a fireside chat. So Ryan and I attempted to give you the best of the fireside background that we had. In my case, my fireside is full of plants, and I have a mantle full of Halloween decorations. And Ryan went the virtual route. So this is our virtual attempt at a fireside chat. Thank you for that patience there. But a little bit more on Ryan, his background, and how this session will work. So if you can believe it, Ryan's journey into problem solving and design thinking was actually kicked off in the US military, which is not normally what we think of as the most generative space for innovation and creativity. At the time, Ryan was serving as an Army Special Operations officer, and he attended an introductory course on systems design thinking, and then really kind of kicked off this journey around passion and energy for the space that he had not previously experienced. So over the next several years, Ryan would continue to work occasionally with the Joint Special Operations University Design and Facilitation team. And then in 2021, he began a master's degree, Master's of Science in Creativity and Change Leadership, which is out of the SUNY Buffalo State University within their International Center for Studies in Creativity. So if any of you are interested in a fascinating degree program, that sounds almost like I want to go back to school for that master's degree. And he founded ChangeLead Solutions, which is kind of the auspices with which he's talking to us today, with the vision and mission of helping organizations and individuals understand how to cultivate and develop the creativity and innovation that he believes is inherent within all humans. And as Ryan continues to build up the business, he also continues to work full-time as a Strategic Innovation Facilitator at the US Space Command, where he and his teammates are actively developing a design and innovation education program, along with running workshops and sessions for various parts of the command. So we're super excited to have you here with us today, Ryan. Audience, just for your reference, Ryan and I are going to go into a little bit of structured Q&A for the first part of this hour, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. We encourage you to be using the chat feature while we're doing the structured Q&A. Eleanor is going to monitor the chat. I'm going to monitor the chat. And we can bring some of those questions real time into our conversation, and we can also save them for the end of the conversation. So please do feel free to engage with the chat over the course of the structured Q&A before we open it up to the audience for questions. And with that, Ryan, I am going to kick us off. I have to say my first question is one of my own personal curiosity. When you tell a client that you want to bring play and board games into the facilitation, what is their reaction? I am dying to know how it's met when you say, I want to bring a board game into our facilitation. What's your experience like there?
I think I'll start with a lot of my experience in using these so far has been conceptual. So I've been running workshops and seminars where we've been doing this real time so people could see the concept. The only place that I've had a chance to try to bring this in like a live facilitation capacity is at Space Command. And the secret there is my teammates are obviously, one is a creative researcher by trade, the other one is a prolifically published designer. They're open to this kind of stuff, so it's not a hard sell. But I don't necessarily go to the commander and say, I'm going to bring in some board games and that's what we're going to do today. I just say, hey, we have a scheduled agenda. We're going to go through some icebreaker activities. We're going to use some hands-on learning. Like we keep it very nebulous. We don't need to be going into the details necessarily. We just always tell them to trust the process. I do get a mixture. Some people get excited when they see that that's what's going to happen. Other people definitely more skeptical. I think the DoD in particular has a culture of all work and no play, which is why we're all very dull boys. It's not necessarily the easiest environment, so we don't necessarily leave the games. We sort of build our way into it. We kind of get them open and comfortable, and maybe it's a day 2 activity or halfway through the day that we start using that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, it's been positive, especially once we get going. It's a very disarming activity. So even the staunchest resistors will fall into the game and participate pretty actively, in many cases competitively. So
Competitively, I love that. Let's talk a little bit about those staunch resistors. So you'd mentioned that the team that you're working with sounds like they have a little bit more of a growth mindset. For those who aren't familiar with mindsets, that's the work of Carol Dweck. She's a professor at Stanford University. She looked at fixed mindsets versus growth mindset. And those who have a growth mindset tend to be more open to activities like play. But I'm curious, especially given your academic background in creativity, why are we scared of play in the workplace? Are we worried about looking silly? Are we just worried about perceptions that we're not working hard enough, or that fun should not be in the workplace? Like you said, all work, no play makes Ryan a dull boy. Why are we scared of play in the workplace? What's going on there? I think you're muted, Ryan.
So it's a pretty multi-layered question as to why this is the case. It's pretty systemic, especially in Western culture. So by that, we're going to say generally from the Caucasus Mountains over to Hawaii, in that zone, where largely Western colonization occurred. That culture, at least in the U.S., is more deeply rooted in some of our roots with respect to the Puritans coming over. The Puritan work ethic or the Protestant work ethic is sort of a systemic ideal that, for better or for worse, we've brought forward, whether we meant to or not, where there is this idea that we aren't really, your toil and your work is your way of living out your faith and being held accountable to God. And so there was a point in time very early on in life where even kids and teens were expected to just rise to the occasion and contribute to society. And we get things like, those colloquial sayings are like idle hands are the devil's workshop and, spare the rod, spoil the child. Those are all carryover type of phrases and mentality that has its roots in that Protestant work ethic, which was originally a term coined by Max Weber when he was doing his work on the rise of capitalism and social networking and how communities interact. And social network theory actually predates my time in creativity and more of my time in the Army, but it's very interesting to see those two worlds intersect pretty rapidly because creativity is inherently an interdisciplinary study. So there's a lot of philosophy and psychology and sociology mixed in with a lot of empirical sciences and cognitive sciences or neurocognitive sciences that all sort of intersect as we try to navigate this space. And particularly why people are so reluctant to creativity. But I think the better way to cage this in a modern context is I'm sure many of you have heard of Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, which I don't want to be wrong, but I feel like I'm fairly confident saying is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time, and it was titled "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" And the premise of this was him talking about our model for public education in the U.S. and in the U.K. And likely many other places around the world, although certain countries are making reforms faster than others, is still modeled after the industrial era and the industrial revolution. So schools were designed to maximize productivity, convergence, efficiency, and even the scheduling of schools, like the hours are just their shift work. They're not reflective of how life actually is. And in his talk, he mentions in the beginning, if they went into a kindergarten classroom and they asked the classroom, how many of you are creative? And like almost universally, to a person, they all raise their hands. Across this longitudinal study, which I think it was George Land actually that did this study. Across the study, they went back at like third grade, about 50% of the class raised their hand when asked. By sixth grade, maybe only a third. And then at graduation, there was like one or two that as adults would identify as creative. And it was this process of shaping the narrative of what it means to be creative. And I think many of us probably growing up or even currently might even still, when they hear the term creative, immediately default to something that's very arts centric. So the things that come to mind are those eminent creators, the Van Goghs, the Einsteins, people that have created to an extent that their entire body of work defines who they were and what they've contributed to society, and it's still important today. From a lesser scale, we look at people that work in media, film, marketing, and advertising, things where we're using different mediums to convey messages or to put some sort of visual flavor onto what creativity is. But in reality, creativity is inherent in everybody. At the very lowest level, every time you make a personal connection between your life experiences and a new concept that you're learning about, that is a form of exercising the same cognitive power that we use when we're being creative, and they call that mini C creativity. Little C creativity is when we find interesting ways to stretch our budget month to month, and then we start getting into professional and eminent creativity as we more deliberately apply our creative capacity to specific fields. So it is incredibly subjective, but ultimately everybody is and can continue to develop their creativity across the span of their life and their work, regardless of what field you're in. And then I think the very last part of this that is important to mention is that in our society, we have developed this fear of failure and this fear of rejection. Creativity, one of the core competencies that you have to embrace and accept when you are working in creativity or trying to innovate is this idea that failure is just your first iteration. And being comfortable with the risk of failure and the risk of something not being effective the first time, or people not buying in. A lot of the best ideas that we take for granted now, when they first came out, they were not universally accepted, and it took a lot of time for society to catch up to that way of thinking or the appreciation for those ideas. So I think we don't like the idea of failure because we, again, have been conditioned in our society to be very performance driven, our value is rooted in our productivity and how well we perform and how far above and beyond we go. And so the risk of failure jeopardizing your career progression is difficult to process for a lot of folks. So.
Yeah. And we have both the fear of failure, and then psychologically we also have the fear of change ingrained in us, which we see in the status quo bias and in the creativity bias. So we have all these inherent human psychological states that are really working against us when we're trying to be creative. And it's fascinating. For everyone's reference, the study that Ryan was talking about was "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" If you want to check out that TED Talk, and it's fascinating to me because it starts from such a young age when we start getting the creativity constrained and tempered down exactly, and kind of pushed out of us in favor of this. I love that you called school shift work. We start shift work when we're 5, 6 years old, and then we continue this idea of structured shift work. into our careers. And so my next question, and I promise we'll get to the board games conversation, folks, but I'm curious, as we look first into the science of play and creativity, if we can talk a little bit about what the science actually says about the value of adding play into our workday and into facilitations, because I feel like so much of what we read these days is all about the science of productivity. It's how to maximize your time. It's how to work more efficiently. It's how to increase your output. And then at the same time, save yourself some extra time in your day. And one of our, real pain points at Rising Solutions is looking at the fact that the design of the modern workplace does not embrace the creativity science at all. So let's talk about the science a little bit. What does the science say about the benefits of play?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite areas that I'm currently exploring as part of my thesis development for my master's, because this could be a multi-part series on its own, because you could approach the science of play and humor and levity from multiple different disciplines. You can look at it specifically from like the learning and cognitive development side of the house. You can look at it from the psychological empowerment, safety, and development perspective. The work that I'm doing is digging deeper into this concept of embodied cognition, which is lived experiences and how they manifest in our particular creative output. So there's a lot of ways that you can approach this concept, and it is actually very well studied. And I don't think that the jury is out on this in the same way that it is on creativity as a whole with respect to the truth and the applicability of this research. So my favorite scholar on play writ large is Stuart Brown. Dr. Brown is out of the National Institute of Play, and he has another TED Talk. This one's much longer, so this is one you'll have to dedicate some time to. I believe it's like 20, 25 minutes on the science of play, where he'll go over the broad brushstrokes of each of those little categories that I just mentioned and sort of look at the historical aspect. Play has been something that we as a human race have constantly applied and used, and that is one of the reasons that we are set apart and why we have inherent creativity and have evolved in the way that we have to be different than other species on this earth. And I think there is not just like a benefit from it, but there's a fundamental need. Like there is a need for people to find ways to play. So from the scientific aspect of it, it's how we learn, it's how we explore new concepts, and we start experimenting with the ability to be creative, to apply synthesis, to apply inquiry. Anybody who has children, when your kids are as young as 1, 2 years old, you start to see them, especially if you have pets, you start to see them doing things like acting like a cat or a dog or a dinosaur, right? This early form of role playing is this sort of like empathetic exploration or this inquiry into the perspective or what it would be like to be that thing, to be the animal that they're playing as. When you see kids play house and they're assuming these roles of mom, dad, the baby, they are trying to synthesize what they have seen and they have watched from their perspective as children, but we do as adults, and they're trying to understand and embody and learn more by pretending to be that way. That is a form of cognitive development. And then obviously the most basic of them is playing make believe. The invisible friends, the imagination, going outside and watching your backyard turn into a vast wilderness. This is incredibly important for allowing kids who don't have the ability to autonomously just go out and explore to explore in a secondhand way, to be someone that they aren't, to try new personalities and personality traits and those core competencies on. Maybe one character they have is braver than they are in real life. And we can even see that manifest in contemporary music artists. I believe Nicki Minaj has like 3 or 4 personalities that she puts on depending on what she's trying to accomplish, whether in the song or in an interview, because she feels that her default persona is maybe not always the most confident or maybe not always the most well spoken. So she has these different personas that help her get into the right headspace. And so that's a form of using play and make believe and humor to experiment or manifest certain traits that maybe we don't default to right away. And then humor in particular actually creates an open posture, increases team building, and opens us up to, it actually primes a growth mindset. So if you're looking at fixed versus growth mindset, when you have humor and levity incorporated in, then you are more open to trying new things, to taking a risk even. And I actually, it was convenient timing. There was a TED Talk that just posted a couple days ago that I saw pop up on LinkedIn. And these two women, and I should have written their names down, and I'm going to look them up in a moment. They published a book in 2021. They are Stanford professors in the business department, and they did a TED Talk on humor in the workplace. And it was fascinating research. And what they found is that even a really bad joke at the end of a sales pitch, and the example they gave was, hey, this is the lowest price I'm willing to go. My price is X, and if you buy it at this price, I'll throw in my pet frog. You know, as bad of a joke as that is, something that simple can actually increase someone's willingness to buy by up to 20%, which is a huge return on investment for very little cost applied, right? Like it doesn't cost you much, maybe a little bit of egg on your face or to look a little weird, that fear of rejection or a funny look, but the return on investment can be totally worth it. So they have an entire TED Talk, and I didn't even get to finish it because I discovered it yesterday, and I was watching it this morning. Wonderful research, very, very recent, last 3-4 years, most of it. So that is, I'll put that in the chat as soon as I look them up. And then we can go on to like more established manifestations of this now. So Lego Serious Play, very popular, Fortune 500 favorite, right? And their theories are very rooted in sits on the Harley's. I can't ever say his name right, so that's how I have to pronounce it. Is flow theory, which is this idea where we're trying to find that balance between the challenge of a new task and our ability to perform that task. So the challenge can't outperform our ability too much because then we're going to give up, but it can't be too easy because then we're not going to take it seriously. So flow theory is this like that special nebulous middle ground where we kind of lose track of ourselves. We lose sense of time. We get so invested in the work or the activity because it's challenging enough and we're invested enough intrinsically that we want to develop in it. And before you know it, the workday's over. And I think we've all been in various states of flow for different activities before. But the bigger aspect that Lego Serious Play uses is this theory called hand-brain connection or hand-brain learning, which has done a lot of research on the neuroscience side of the house, where our hands and our tools as human beings as we evolve are part of how our brain processes the world. That's why we always default to the 5 cardinal senses among the 33 other senses we now classify. And as people are trying to utilize their higher function to verbalize concepts, they may not be able to. That vocab may not be there. They might be too ineffable. But as they're building something with Legos, going through the exercises, applying the techniques, their brain is actually creating the story for them. And they're able to use the Legos as a catalyst to sort of connect metaphorically to what they're trying to convey. And it also is received more holistically by their teammates or the facilitator or their bosses. So, and that's really deep. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I probably can't go into the specifics of that. But Lego Serious Play and hand-brain connection that's like a decade plus of deep research. But you can see that when people do things like doodling. Doodling is when people are like in class and or sitting there in a session, you just kind of you're processing that way. People who have to write notes by hand, even though they're available in a PowerPoint, that's hand-brain connection. Even things like playing an instrument. People who pick up an instrument, they're more likely to be, better at math. They're more likely to be creative, etc. All these, correlative, things we do to try to promote things like arts and musical activities in schools and create that cut of funding. Well, that applies across every other discipline. Just having an outlet to allow our hands to do some of the thinking and some of the expression actually increases our overall cognitive bandwidth. So, and then playfulness and humor as a core competency is actually a measurable trait when it comes to like divergent thinking skills. So for the educators in the room, or the talented and gifted program really stemmed out of E. Paul Torrance's work at the University of Georgia and the Torrance Institute for Gifted and Talented Education. I can't remember the full name now, it's been changed. But we still use his model, the Torrance incubation model. And he created the Torrance test, which was this assessment of divergent thinking capacity, which before they had codified talented and gifted, those kids were often put in special ed because they really weren't they weren't fitting the system that we've developed in these schools. People were converging, right, and becoming productive. They take the answer at face value. You said it was the answer, so I know it's the answer, and I do it this way. No, these are the kids that ask why, or they get the same answer, but they go the long way maybe, or they find a new mechanism to apply. And so there wasn't a system in place to understand why these kids were this way. A lot of them probably would classify as neurodivergent, whether they were spectrum or ADHD, which is a spectrum in its own right, or other forms of divergent expression. And so Torrance created the Torrance test to assess repeatedly whether or not those skills were actually at play, and if they were, could you develop them further? Could you harness that and make some more out of it? So he created those 17 skills, which are called the Beyonder skills, and I use them still when I'm working with organizations too, because it applies, even though it was built on K-12 education, it applies universally. These core competencies actually can be measured, and they can be fostered specifically, both deliberately and you can weave it in to your curriculum. In fact, Dr. Cindy Burnett has a company called I think it's just called Creative Education. But her book, Weaving Creativity into Curriculum, it's again oriented towards the K-12 model, but those concepts and those tools that she provides are applicable to any organizational training setting as well. You just have to maybe reframe the context. So all that to be said, you can develop these skills, and play and humor and levity and openness are all things that are actually core competencies for fostering creativity. And if we know that play is the easiest and most efficient way to tap into and develop that, then why we are sequestering that in a workplace environment is, questionable. So I can elaborate if there's any part of that you want me to go down the rabbit hole on.
Well, on that note, I was just going to say for our audience, we just gave you an enormous amount of scientific research and theory. So again, please do feel free to drop your questions into the chat as you're hearing things that you're curious about. We'll be tracking comments in the chat. I can also incorporate them into the conversation. Plus, we'll have our Q&A at the end. And do you just want to say something, Ryan?
Yeah, I saw Dave's chat comment, the Carvana vending machine. Excellent example. Nobody took that seriously. Now the big thing you're going to see in ads is like, hey, you can just show up to the dealership with keys ready to go because you'll do all the stuff in advance. You don't have to negotiate. You get your financing done. Everything's done at home. You show up, prove who you are, and there's your keys. In some cases, dealers will now start delivering, but that was a good example. Netflix is another example. I think they threw their pitch at Blockbuster, and Blockbuster rejected it. Blockbuster is no more. In fact, in a cruel twist of fate, I believe there's a Netflix movie coming out about the fall of Blockbuster. So that's another example of where the ideas maybe they were a risk. Yes, they challenged the system, but the status quo or the existing model was not willing to adopt it early enough, and they paid the price. So those are great examples.
So let's get a little bit more tactical and practical here for our facilitators on the call, those who are interested in bringing in board games or bringing more play into their facilitations. I think most of us innovation facilitators, we know a lot of exercises and activities that bring out creativity, but play, so to speak, can be a little bit different than an exercise that's meant to be generative. It's meant to produce new ideas. And certainly this concept of board games, I think, is a little bit more novel in the facilitation space. So maybe start by telling us what is the most powerful example that you've seen of play creating value, play really proving a return on investment in a workplace environment?
I think that once I had seen people incorporate the idea that we saw this a lot in the pandemic, so this may not be specific to me anymore, but when people realized that you could stop, go somewhere, do an activity, whether it's working out, interact with people, playing basketball, incorporating those opportunities and empowering those opportunities throughout the day can have a huge impact on your overall company culture and job satisfaction, knowing that you're allowed to not always be in go mode, and you need that time to sort of embrace play, but also reflect and incubate. From a personal example, I was helping facilitate with JSOW at the NATO school in Oberammergau, Germany, and it was an interesting audience. This is the pilot course for them. They hadn't embraced the design concept yet. And we had a lot of different people in the room. They're all military, so there was a little bit of homogeny in that sense. But there was one gentleman in particular who was a retired Marine Corps officer from the U.S., who was then an academic teaching like international game, just to kind of see what it was like. And for the first 4 or 5 days, I could not have had like a bigger brick wall. You know, his entire posture and demeanor was just, you just tell like it was just hitting his forehead and just falling off. He just was not buying it. You know, this idea of like paradigm shift, using Legos or Play-Doh, or getting up and doing some of the puzzle games that we have, or any of the other stuff that we do to sort of just like maybe reset the brain. Because when we use games in that concept, we're not doing it to in a generative capacity. It's usually to either highlight a point or concept that we just covered, because we are teaching and doing simultaneously. So we'll teach the concept and then we'll kind of build on it as they go through the facilitation. Or we're just providing a break, really a brain break, sort of, maybe after lunch there's something that's just a divergent game, just to like get them back into that sort of capacity. This gentleman really, he participated, and like you could tell that by day 3 and 4 he was embracing the games more. He's having a lot of fun, getting more creative. But then morning of day 5, which is the afternoon, they're supposed to give their deliverable to the sponsor, each of the groups, and you could just tell like he came in and it was like it clicked. It was a total. He was, he didn't have his suit and tie on. He was in like just a polo and slacks, which for him was like dressing down big time. And he wiped the entire board and like redid the entire concept. And now he's adjunct professor at JSOW teaching design, because he went through the painful growth, but he came out of the side so convinced that he now applies that in his university classes. He continues to teach that for both NATO militaries, and at times he'll come assist back stateside. So that was a huge transition. I mean, he went from a resistor to a facilitator in less than a year. And then other cases I've seen wallflowers in organizations who felt like maybe if you were to talk to them one-on-one, they just felt like they weren't appreciated, they were undervalued, they weren't being leveraged the way they wanted to be, but they had no way to just go talk to the boss and say, hey, because there's too much fear, too much risk. Can't risk losing this job. I have a family to take care of. Using things like Lego Series Play across facilitation actually empowers people within those organizations to communicate in a way that higher level leaders, maybe 2-3 levels up, even in some instances, can hear that. And so prior to one particular workshop, there were a lot of people that kind of struggled to explain exactly why they were wrestling with this like lack of contentment with their job. They didn't quite know. Well, I don't know, just not quite what I want. I feel like I'm not satisfied. But that doesn't help. Just saying I'm not satisfied is not how to fix a problem necessarily. But by the end, they were able to articulate specifically where their points of contention were, where the organization was or was not doing that, kind of contributed to their discontentment, which allowed the leadership of that organization to take proactive steps in either moving someone to a more appropriate position or giving them additional responsibilities, or in some cases it was just workplace culture shifts. And it really improved. Not everybody stayed. I think people still leave. You can never make everybody happy, but by and large, the majority of people were very pleased. And like we did a 6-month like follow-up survey. Things that universally improved. I can't remember the statistics now, but I would say overwhelmingly positive feedback on, we've actually taken this stuff and applied it, because we try to end the workshop with a charter, that they kind of develop together based on all of the outputs of that workshop. So that it's kind of a contract, I guess, between all the participants that, hey, we've identified that we want to work on this, we're going to do it, without having the opportunity to use things like Lego Series Play or other types of sort of fun activities as part of the way of not just reflecting on and understanding what it is very deep in that ineffable space in their brain, but being able to articulate it is hugely beneficial, and something that I've been happy to watch. That's my favorite part, I think, is when the light bulb turns on. It's very satisfying to see someone suddenly have a whole new set of tools or perspectives to address current problems with. So
now, you've mentioned a couple times Legos. You've mentioned board games. Let's get really practical here, and let's talk about how we bring those into facilitations.
yes.
Are there specific problem statements or specific types of facilitations where you think to yourself, like, oh, Legos would be a great fit here, or oh, this board game, does it matter which board game you choose? Like, is there a difference between like Monopoly and Scrabble and Snake Oil? And so let's get really practical. Like, what are our options for play? Legos, board games, how do you know when they're the right fit, and how do you bring them in?
Yeah, and this is my favorite answer. Nobody likes to get it, and it really depends. This is where you, as a facilitator, have to be slightly intuitive and also ask the right questions. Either if you're consulting or facilitating within your own organization, it's your own people, it's a lot easier. You have a better pulse on that, so you can make a better assessment. If you're being brought in from the outside, you need to spend a lot of time not just talking with a sponsor, but seeing if you have an opportunity to interact with who's going to be participating, whether your stakeholder groups are, in advance to get a little bit of a gauge on where people are headspace wise coming into the facilitation in advance. And there is a little bit of work that needs to be done on the front end, so it's not as easy as just showing up with Monopoly per se. And I wouldn't recommend Monopoly just because it's a very time consuming game. I think that's a big factor too, is knowing your limitations on how much time you have. If this is a 1 day workshop, like, you really don't want to be taking 4.5 hours on board games. It shouldn't be that deep. I haven't used board games specifically for a practical facilitation within respect of a generative capacity, because that's just not the way I've studied and applied these. I use this in more of an organizational training and development standpoint. So if we are trying to, rather than do a facilitation where essentially I'm giving you a fish, right? This would be the situation where I'm brought in to teach you how to fish. How do you, as organizational trainers, cultivate those creative competencies across different departments, different teams, regardless of whether or not they're specifically in the creative team or the innovation team, but within your accounting and your marketing and your business administration folks or your engineers. How do you empower them to embrace some of those core competencies that don't come naturally, I guess, to them, or are not necessarily professionally as emphasized? And so the one thing that I found to be, from my DoD experience, the most challenging was whenever we talk about those affective squishy skills like empathy or risk or trying to think of some other, like, I guess the growth mindset even in itself, and like the attributes of that, so open-mindedness, like those things are easy to go through a PowerPoint and say, this is what it is. Everyone got it? Okay, we're all going to be more empathetic. We're all going to do better on diversity. We're all going to be more inclusive. Everyone say, yeah, we are. But those things actually take practice. They take repetitions. They take opportunities. Like, just because you can define it doesn't mean you can apply. There's a lot of things I can define that I'm not an engineer, but I can define what I think engineering is. It doesn't mean I can do it. So how do we get reps on those things that aren't as straightforward as formulas, processes, and things like that? Well, we have to create the conditions to do so. And I think board games are that catalyst that I have found to be very effective in highlighting those particular skills. The difficult part as a facilitator is finding the right game for the skill within the context of how you're delivering it. Because what you're going to need to do is you're first going to identify what that key skill would be, and then you're going to need to find out how much time you have and how you're going to not only use the game to highlight the skill, but then foster the conversation afterwards, which is the more important part, is the self-reflective aspect where people are, then you're not telling them that they did it, but you're kind of pulling it, and they're saying, oh yeah, well, I noticed this. And so I like Snake Oil. You brought that up. I've used that in the blog we're working on. It is my favorite example because it was a game that I bought on a whim off of Amazon for $15, and I brought to my first workshop, and it ended up being, it's to this day my favorite game for a lot of these skills. It's really fast, it's a lot of fun, and you can hit a lot of them at one time. And for those who haven't played Snake Oil, it's really easy. If you've played Apples to Apples or Cards Against Humanity, anything like that, very similar concept. The catch is that whoever's the judge will draw a little card, and that card will have two personas on it. It'll have, and they'll be ridiculous. It'll be like, a peg leg pirate or a 14-year-old high school cheerleader. Those are the two options they have. And they got to say, well, I got to be one of these two. And they're going to say, all right, I am a 14-year-old cheerleader. This gets really fun. Like by round 2 or 3, like people are starting to get more goofy. You'll see like the big surly bearded guy pick the 14-year-old cheerleader instead of the pirate. They start inadvertently challenging themselves. I think that happens. But initially, they have to then put themselves in a headspace of, all right, I'm this person now, and a really good group, you can encourage this, you can set it as a ground rule. We'll role play that. That's a lot of fun to watch. But the participants then, they have their 7 cards. They got different nouns on them. They have to take 2 of those cards, mush them together, and create a product of some kind. And they're going to sell it now to that persona. So they have the job of not only trying to figure out, would this product be something this persona would want, but then how do I sell it? Do I improv on the fly, throw a pitch out there, 30 to 60 seconds long, that's funny and appealing and makes this persona want to pick my product as the winner. That game in that particular group, I put everyone there was strangers. They weren't allowed to sit with anybody they knew. They were the loudest. They laughed the most, and it was just a lot of fun to watch how they so quickly meshed as a group. But across all of the groups that I ran this with, regardless of what game they were playing, one of the things we could stop and do is we could pause and we could say, "Hey, tell me something about Chris," and then they would say, "Oh, well, notice that Chris read the rule book cover to cover out loud for everybody. Chris seems like the kind of guy that's going to follow the rules and be a stickler for doing the rules, play the game exactly the way it is." I might go to a different table and say, "All right, tell me about Danielle." They would say, "Oh, Danielle glanced at the rules, we set up the game, and then we just kind of were winging it. And if we've got to a sticking point, then we'd look back at the rules." So within the first 30 minutes of playing games with total strangers, you kind of start to have a pretty big read on some of their default modes of operating, right? Which across a corporate environment or a professional environment, that can take weeks because people are putting on a front for those limited interactions. But once they get into gameplay, like, you can start to see pretty quickly how people manifest those traits without even knowing that they're projecting it. So it's a hugely beneficial tool from the team building and collaboration standpoint. But it can also be really huge in highlighting things like empathy, which we could see in Snake Oil, risk taking, and humor and levity, which were all things that were required to sell that pitch. Idea fluency, origination, make it sing, make it ring. These are all things that are core competencies of divergence and ideation and innovation that were manifest in that Snake Oil game. And I didn't have to point it out. They had a chart, and we went through the chart, and they ticked off. I can't remember. I think I had 21 skill sets on that chart. They ticked off 17 of the 21 that they could actively engage with during the game. And then we got into a long conversation about why is it hard to do that in the workplace in general. And so they were able to identify from their own perspectives where their organizational barriers were with those skills. So that's just one example. Now, to get into how you can bring this in, number one, you have to just commit to doing it. That's the hardest part. You're going to have to say, "Hey, we're going to use this tool," and then you're going to have to do the legwork of finding the right game. In some cases, maybe you played some and they just come to you. In other cases, you're going to have to do what I did, which is start going down the rabbit hole on Google. I watch a lot of YouTube videos. I think they're your friend in this case, because I love my wife. She likes to play games sometimes, but a lot of games require more than just 2 people. So try as I might sit down with Jasmine to play these games and try to get my head around how I'm going to apply them. Like, usually, if I don't have other people able to come over, I'll have to watch a YouTube video of other people playing the game so that I can start to say, "Oh, okay, I can see where I can pull this out." And then you can make modifications. If you've used the game a few times, you can tweak the rule sets, which I've done with certain games like Dixit for storytelling, for instance, and identity. That's another good one for that game. And then once you start creating this sort of like database, this running list, so to speak, of like different games and how they apply these different skills, then you can start more rapidly incorporating either the entire game or elements of the game. The other thing you got to do is make sure you really understand the rules. I learned this the hard way. I did pick a new game that I was very excited about. Everything on paper seemed like this was going to be the perfect game, and it might be. But I didn't have a chance to go down that YouTube video route, and so I just kind of hoped that the group would figure it out. And it was a lot more complicated than we had time to do, and I couldn't answer their questions to help them go faster. So I think they encountered a little more frustration. So you'll have to not only know the games, but really understand the mechanics behind them. After that, it's facilitation as usual. You're asking open-ended questions. You're highlighting particular skill sets, then maybe you're priming those questions in that particular direction, with respect to maybe empathy or risk taking or rejection or humor. If it's team building, then about the team dynamics aspect of it. So that's where then it gets back into that traditional model, if you will, of facilitation.
So
Uh,
it's if I can try to synthesize for us, Ryan, because I want to open it up to some questions for the audience. We got about 10 minutes left. So I think what I'm hearing in summary is that board games, at least in the capacity that you've used them, don't necessarily lead to generative output. So you're not necessarily using them so that people brainstorm and come up with ideas. What you're doing is that the board game gives attendees permission to experience new emotions, new behaviors, new competencies. And the permission of the board game not just brings out the playfulness, but it also helps model skills that typically under a change management or an organizational development initiative, we have a lot of different techniques as facilitators that we might use to try to get people to change their behavior. But really, the board game just goes from 0 to 100 immediately by having you assume a character, and then you're able to take on those behaviors and actually practice them. And I'm wondering maybe if, especially in the new workplace movement around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, this could be a fascinating way to help give people more ways to practice and experience behaviors instead of just paying lip service to DEI, which I think is a lot of criticism around that movement. Last thoughts from you before we kick it to questions?
Yep, you actually, very good point then that I'll close with then is board games create the psychological safety necessary for that to happen quickly. It also provides that unifying cause or goal for people that is divorced from the actual risk or the impetus of the organizational goal or challenge. So from a facilitation standpoint, yeah, maybe you're trying to facilitate a new idea or innovation for a particular challenge and it's high stakes, high visibility. Well, if you get people in a group and they just dive right into that, there's more invested interest. There's more at stake, and so people are a lot more passionate. It's going to be more challenging. It's not the place to explore and experiment necessarily right away. Board games remove that. You have a common goal. Everyone unites behind. It's low risk. Psychological safety is provided for people to actually just kind of drop all that guard, which is why we see it happen so fast. And then Dave, I saw you about the airplanes thing. That is the same. It's not board games per se, but what you're doing is you're providing a hand-brain connection of why some of those concepts of aerodynamics are important to consider. You know, they are now connecting the experience with the new learning that you're about to provide. So that actually is exactly what we're talking about.
So it looks like,
it's a little bit.
yeah, we've got a question from Lori. When you have less time, do you have any good quick exercises or games that can be done with Legos or Play-Doh? So again, getting that hand-brain connection when people come back kind of as an icebreaker. So it's like a smaller, more condensed version of a larger board game. What would you recommend?
Okay, and actually, this will get after Candace's question as well. So two birds with one stone. One of the ones we use a lot is this thing we call paper roll, the paper roll game. And for those that haven't done it or haven't done a version of it, you're going to start with get a piece of butcher like paper, like the big flip charts. Just roll it up into a tube and tape that tube shut. You get everybody in a circle, and you're going to establish the rules, but you're not going to get really specific. The rules are going to be, hey, you can't use any words, and you can't do what someone else has already done in the circle, right? And so you'll start, and I'll take it, and I'll just baseball bat, okay. If it's right, then you pass it on. Next person will do fly fishing, right? And when it gets to the end of the first iteration, you're just gonna say, all right, what did you guys think about the ideas? What were some trends you noticed? Well, we all did like sports things. Like, well, do you think you did sports things because I started with something that was sports related and then you primed it? And then you're gonna go through a second iteration, and you're gonna continue pulling the thread on what changed. How are things different? Did communication, or did we go from something that's specific like baseball bat to something that's more of a concept like, I don't know, I can't even think of one off the top of my head now. But we get more theoretical, I guess. I'm sorry, my throat's really dry. Excuse me. And then what you're hoping for, and what you don't want to have to do as a facilitator, but if by round 4 it hasn't happened, you might have to. You're hoping for someone to unroll it, tear it, crumple it, do something else. Break the unspoken rule. Then you get to the end of that round after it's been torn or broken or otherwise mangled. After that happens, you're going to hear it every single time. Without that, you're going to go, oh, you're going to hear that a lot. Because people have it in their head. They're trying to project out. They're like, okay. People, the first couple rounds are like, oh, well, someone took mine, and then I didn't know what to do for a second, so I had to think really quickly. But when they see that thing get torn, at first it's like there's a little bit of pain. They're like, ah, crap, I had all these ideas that I was going to do. But then it's like, think about all the possibilities that just opened up. Now we've opened up from one type of application to like almost endless, really, so many ways to do it. And that's when you start to see the ideas get absolutely wild, which is what we're driving towards, is embracing multiple perspectives. There's all one thing. Then they're going to be there and you say, well, what do people think? Well, I didn't know we could do that. And they're like, well, I didn't say you couldn't do it. Why? I never said you had to keep this thing rolled up. I never said you had to keep it in one piece, that you couldn't crumple it. None of those were conditions that I didn't even say we had to pass it in a circle. I just passed it to my left, and then you assumed that it was going to pass to the left, So it's pretty quick, roughly 15 minutes. But number one, it starts priming that divergent thinking, getting those juices flowing, but also starts to highlight things like challenging assumptions and paradigms. Why do we think that things have to go a certain way? Why do we apply rules that aren't explicitly given and apply unnecessary constraints, especially when we're ideating? We start to self-select. Well, I can't do that because I can't unroll the thing. Well, who said? And it only takes someone taking that risk to open up the best of our ideas. And it feels like by round 3, people are feeling like they're slower until that happens. And then all of a sudden it's rapid fire. And they start maybe incorporating props, where you'll see people be brought in using partners like, hey, can you hold this? And then, they'll hold it and they'll do like the limbo or something. You start to see we're now breaking the rules and we're experimenting more and more and more as we go. That is a really fast, really fun way of I love doing that one after lunch, like one-day facilitation. That's a great post-lunch one because it allows people to kind of shake off the sleepiness, get back. And I'm telling you, they will laugh. There will be be careful be mindful, I guess, of your environment. I've done this, and then we've gotten yelled at for being too loud. Like there were people working below us, and they were like, "You guys are way too loud," because people are just laughing. I mean, full belly laughs out loud. Group of people in uniform, these colonels and brigadier generals, these one-star, they're all there. And I love it as a facilitator because I always highlight that the ones that usually break the rules first are the captains and the majors. The lower down guys are the first ones to do it. I had a staff sergeant that was the first one to unroll the form, and the colonel next to him looked like he was about to you could just see it welling up. And then, but that's something that we take for granted in a hierarchical organization, which is how most corporations are structured. Is that some of the best, most creative ideas are going to be buried. And if we don't set the psychological conditions for them to embrace those ideas, hey, we're missing out on a huge piece of our creative capital. We would rather pay a buttload of money, outsource that creativity to somebody else.
Jeremy's got a great question in that vein as well. And what I was kind of hearing in that last answer, again, is once the roll of paper breaks, there's your permission again. It's like you need to be given permission to be creative. And I think that's really a constraint that comes with the workplace we've designed. And Jeremy's asking, how does the perception of failure and risk affect the focus and participation of embracing change in an organization? Does that play a role, that perception of risk and aversion?
Yes. That's why I don't recommend doing the paper rule game right up front. It's tough to lead with that game, whether it's day one or first of the day, or you only have one day, then definitely wait till after lunch. Because people will still come into that with their persona on, their role. And as much as I can in the military context, we want people to come in civilians, just dressed as regular people, because we want them to come in first name basis, no rank, no position, no role, because that already will create a psychological barrier where, oh man, I can't go against this person's perspective because they are my boss's boss. I can't challenge the status quo because they'll be offended. Like you start, the more things you can impact to take away those initial barriers on the front end, the more rapidly you're going to start dispelling that fear, I guess, of failure, or that perception of I've got to do this, I got to nail this. And the other way is, as a facilitator, knowing when people are more dominant within a group or a breakout or a conversation, and introducing other methods to pull more of the wallflower folks in and give them that voice. Um, so those are the two ways. Like, you're never going to fully dispel people's fear of failure. It's a human nature thing. What you have to do is get them comfortable, or tolerant to risk and tolerant to ambiguity. Not risky per se. You don't want people to be dangerous, but you want them to be comfortable with the fact that, hey, this may not work, and that's okay. Failure needs to be reframed as an opportunity to say, all right, we tried, it didn't work, and what did we learn? And let's try something new, as opposed to you failed, you're out. It's not a one-shot opportunity.
Framing failure as opportunity, that is an amazing way to end this session. We will stay on a few minutes longer. Amos, I know you dropped a question to the chat at the end, so we'll hang out a little bit longer. But for those that need to get on with your day, we thank you so much for joining the session. I hope you learned a lot. We tried to balance the science and theory and research with the practical implications of creativity, science, and bringing board games and play into the workplace. If you're interested in more learning opportunities, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. You can click the QR code and sign up that way. And then promoting just 2 more events around learning that might be interesting to you. On November 17th, we're hosting a session about how to hire for innovation. And we're putting together a panel with a talent agency, along with some other innovation leaders in the space, on what to look for when hiring for innovation. And then on December 1st, we're running our proprietary innovation versus optimization course. It's a 90-minute course all about the difference between these 2 business strategies and why it's important to understand the differences in terms of ROI, LOE allocation, resource allocation, and just expectation management. So if you enjoyed today, we hope to see you again. We will be releasing a recording of the webinar if you'd like to share it. And otherwise, we'll stay on it for a few more minutes for any last questions. Otherwise, thank you for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
And I'll re-engage with Amos's question here too. That is challenging because that's a culture thing. So I'm assuming that in this context, maybe you're talking about an organization you already are part of or familiar with, or are you talking about being brought in as an outside consultant or facilitator? Because I would answer that 2 different ways, depending on how you want to clarify that. But under the assumption that you are already in the organization, playing to their strengths. So I don't want to stereotype, but engineers, probably higher number of people that are in the engineering community professionally, for instance, have probably played Dungeons and Dragons or a similar type of game in their past. Well, what started me on this entire board games journey in the first place was Dungeons and Dragons, and an experience that I had never having played it before, and then being stuck in a tent in Kuwait during quarantine as the entire world shut down with 30 people, not able to leave. We were bored out of our mind. Like, we weren't doing anything. We were supposed to be home, and then we got stuck. So we didn't have active employment, so to speak, but we couldn't go anywhere. And one of our new members had brought all the stuff he needed to do Dungeons and Dragons. None of us had played before. We thought, what the hell? We're here. Nothing better to do. And that by itself was a risk, because a lot of it, it's the military. There's a total mentality about, how you're supposed to perceive yourself or be perceived. And so even just committing to that in a public forum, because we were in the middle of the tent, so there was no hiding it, that was a psychological barrier in its own right. But people committed, and it ended up being a lot of fun. Now, it was clunky at first. We weren't very efficient in it, and the dungeon master, in this case we'll call him the facilitator, had to do a lot more coaching and a lot more pulling, right? Well, we had such a good time doing that over the course of the 6 weeks that we were stuck in that tent that now, 2 years later, we still link up every Sunday on a virtual setting, because we're all over the map now, and continue playing. But what I noticed late in 2021, as we were playing and I was going through my master's, was this idea of idea fluency and originality and how it can be developed. And what I kind of recognized was that, oh man, our creative fluency and originality today compared to how we were in March of 2020 I mean, I wish we had some way to measure that. It was incredible how much more active in the creation and in the originality you could see everyone being, myself included. So that was where I was like, I wonder if there's been any research on this. Found exactly one study, one empirical study on tabletop role-playing games and creativity confidence. All this to say, if you understand the culture that you're in, then it's easier to identify a more accessible game. If you're in a big Brainiac culture, a Jeopardy type of game, like a quiz bowl, something that's a little bit competitive, but like allows them to tap into what they feel like their strengths are, can be a great, easy win. Now, I don't want to make it like, I know it's overused in an academic setting with like the PowerPoint Jeopardy. You have to make it humorous. So don't focus specifically on the topic at hand. That's where you start infusing that levity, that ridiculousness, that silliness. You make people laugh. You get that humor and that open posture established right away. Then you get into the meat and potatoes of your session, and you're going to start seeing that you've already now set conditions psychologically. People came in, they played Jeopardy, they thought they were getting into like academic mode, and these were stupid questions about dumb things that maybe they know about, nerd culture, Comic Con, Kim Kardashian's latest trend, whatever it is that you want to do, means do this like quiz bowl Jeopardy game that will infuse a little bit of like levity, life, and silliness on the front end. Can be done pretty rapidly, and then you get into your session. That's a great way to start kind of setting the psychological conditions for. Hey, the first thing they're gonna think is, well, this isn't gonna be the same kind of training that I'm used to. I already started it differently. So that's what you want to do, is you want to start removing those preconceived notions, those biases, those perceptions we have about organizational training. So.
And Amos, I might add as well, since I'm a little bit more familiar with the types of communities you work with, that in your particular situation, I actually think that play through sport is probably one of the best tools for you to do. And one thing that comes to mind is I ran a facilitation a few years ago where I used the game Capture the Flag to parallel risk aversion and strategy. So in the game Capture the Flag, you're both trying to protect your flag and capture the other team's flag. And you need, as a team, to decide how you're going to allocate your people, your resources. Are all your resources going to protect your flag? In other words, protect your current business? Or are all your resources going to go capture the other flag, which is much more of like a business development focus? Or are you splitting the resources? So I was using the game to parallel business strategy, and I was playing it with several community leaders in Africa, actually in South Africa, and it was tremendously successful because the act of playing the game made them realize, like, if you dump all your resources into your defense, protecting your flag, then you never get any new business. And if you dump all your resources in trying to steal the other flag, then your business is left unprotected. So just knowing your context, Amos, I think play through sport may also be really well received through the type of work you do.
That's actually, I'm going to steal that one now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then if you're looking for trying to foster innovation in that same context, taking a sport that everyone's really familiar with, like soccer, and doing like a mini match of soccer, and then saying, okay, FIFA's now come out and they said they don't really like the way soccer's played. We need to create a new set of rules for soccer that keeps some of the old rules, but introduces totally new elements. How would you rewrite the rules of soccer to make it a more exciting game? And then that's a way to start saying that people are familiar with the concept and they've known it the way it has been for a century or more at this point, and now we're telling them like, hey, we know that it's been working, but like, kind of bored of it. Let's try to find new ways to energize this sport. And that's where you start to say, okay, just because something isn't broke doesn't mean we can't add on or improve upon it. So those are two ways. I think the sports thing, whether you're playing capture the flag or taking a traditional sport and creating new rules and then testing them, might be a fun way to kind of get the same mental repetitions in with a low stakes environment. So.
Great points, Ryan. Well, Ryan has dropped his email into the chat. If you have additional follow-up questions, we're also co-authoring several blogs on play and creativity. that will be coming out over the course of the next few months. So stay tuned for those as well. If this topic is of interest, you'll be able to access those through our newsletter if you want to sign up there. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and formally close out. Hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you for joining, and hope to see you at another conversation in the future.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate being invited out. And then Jeremy, I saw your clarification. If risk is missing, do people care? Yes, if there's intrinsic motivation. So the intrinsic motivation for a game setting where there's no perceived risk of failure is I want to have fun. I want to win the game. I don't want to lose the game. But when the risk is within a zone of tolerance, because everything has risk, there's a risk of losing the game, but is it an important risk to me? That's within my zone of tolerance, then it's not a perceived risk. So what you're doing is you're allowing people to experiment with, how do we apply intrinsic motivation to? So I don't think there's ever a situation where you could say risk is devoid. Your perception of that risk might be within a zone of tolerance where you don't think of it as risky. Professional rock climber doesn't think, going up the side of El Capitan is risky because they have done it so many times that, yeah, there's some risk involved, I suppose, but they're professionals. They know what they're doing. They have a lot of reps. I would not climb El Capitan because I've never done it before. So for me, there's a lot higher risk of injury, failure, death. So that tolerance of risk, or that perception of where I sit in that zone of tolerance, is what is shifted in those conditional settings.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yep. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. All right, everyone. Well, sounds like we have a lot of interest in this topic, so perhaps we'll need to do another session, Ryan. Till then, we will send out the recording, and our thanks to everyone for joining. Have a great day.
See you.
Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed.
you.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.